town, it climbs the mountain and looks out on the sea. At sleeping time or waking, it's there I long to be, to walk again those kindly streets, the place my life began, with the boys of Barnesroyd who hunted for the run. With cudgels stout we roamed about for to hunt the grey droline.
One of the most carefully planned and executed escapes in prison history. That's how one newspaper described the escape from Long Kesh Cage 5 by 9 Irish Republican Socialist prisoners of war on May 5, 1976. The tunnel in Cage 5 resembled nothing like what you would see in the movies, and was indeed quite narrow in parts which required literally to wriggle through. On a number of occasions there were cave-ins when various parts of the ceiling of the tunnel collapsed, and a number of times diggers had to be pulled out by the feet. The tunnel in Cage 5 began in the pad cell cubicle, as it was the second last pad from the end of the hut, which was nearest the fence which surrounded the cage. Each living hut was divided in two with a narrow corridor in the middle of the hut. This was partitioned off into what was called pads, others called them cells or cubicles. The Nissan huts were made up of sheetings of corrugated metal. Escape plans were nothing unusual, but this one had a greater sense of excitement as it was the first tunnel plan, as this cage was closer to the perimeter wall than the other cages which the prisoners were previously. And materials such as chisels and the ingredients for making a small concrete block were smuggled in. Light bulbs were stolen from the hospital quarters, which was in a different place than the camp. Blow heaters, which were in the huts, were converted into pumps for putting oxygen down the tunnel, though this was used in the latter stages. Cooking utensils and food trays were converted into digging equipment. 4 floor tiles were removed intact, which measured about 18 inches square. They dug about 6 foot down and headed towards the perimeter wall. All prisoners were divided up into teams and worked almost 24/7 in the digging. They would stop an hour before lockup at night and an hour before unlock in the morning. Each team throughout the day and night got breaks for food and sleep, with smaller breaks for cups of tea and a smoke. As the tunnel progressed, a stick with a white hanky would be poked up through the ceiling of the tunnel to gauge the distance and direction of the tunnel itself. They normally went down the tunnel wearing just football shorts, as it was quite warm, despite the wetness and flooding at times from rainfall. The ceiling and sides of the tunnel were shored up at various points, which they thought were weak, with bits of wood and sheets from the wooden pads. It was a patchwork job, and lengthy parts of the tunnel had no protection at all, with nothing shoring up the walls and ceiling. They used improvised trowels for digging. Food trays for putting the soil in would be relayed back up the tunnel by prisoners strategically placed along the length of the tunnel. Another team at the entrance would bag the soil and hide the bags between the corrugated sheets of the hut itself. The amount of soil was unbelievable, and eventually every hut was filled with soil between the corrugated sheets. It was a massive operation involving all prisoners in Cage 5. The original plan was to empty the whole cage of those doing or facing big sentences. The night before the escape, there was a heavy rainfall, which caused quite a bit of flooding in the tunnel. Grappling hooks were made from the tubular framework of the chairs, and ropes were made from sheets. Bags of clothes were prepared, as they couldn't get through the tunnel without getting soaked, due to the flooding, which was quite deep in parts. Lookouts were strategically placed, keeping an eye out for Brits patrolling the perimeter and watching the 2 Brit watchtowers. The tunnel fell short of reaching the perimeter, but they were prepared for such an eventuality. They cut through a perimeter barbed wire fence and scaled a 20-foot-high wall with the improvised grappling hooks and ropes. There were, in fact, 10 escapees who emerged at the end of the Cage 5 tunnel. But the 10th tunneler, Volunteer Desi Grew, injured his leg at the final wall scaling stage of the escape and had to return via the subterranean passage to his Nissan hut. On October 9, 1990, Volunteer Desi Grew and Volunteer Martin McCaughey were ambushed in a shoot-to-kill operation by an undercover unit of the British Army. Both IRA volunteers were shot in the back and suffered multiple wounds in sustained bursts of gunfire. The 9 Irish Republican prisoners of war who successfully escaped were John Eddie MacNichol, Seamus O'Kane, Joe Kelly, Jerry Clancy, Carr O'Doherty, Harry Flynn, Brendan McManus, Henry Doherty, and Jerry Steenson. The following morning, their fellow prisoners refused to leave their huts to delay the discovery of the escape. Unfortunately, 2 of the escapees were captured some 10 miles away later that day by the British Army. The remaining 7 Republican prisoners made good their escape. Several undercover British Army death squads were dispatched to track down and kill them. Their deployment had been authorized at cabinet level by the British government of the time, and the death squads were armed with a variety of non-standard issue weapons. Their use of unconventional weaponry added weight to the widely held belief that if the undercover units had made good on their heinous manhunt, then the escapees would have been murdered in cold blood. Actually, one of the death squads traveling in an unmarked van were stopped at an Irish Army checkpoint. And in contrast to the immediate imprisonment Republicans routinely received at the hands of Free State forces, the 8-man death squad were quickly flown back to their lairs following a brief court appearance. The 1976 Long Kesh escape was a major success because of a large number of Republican prisoners putting their hearts and souls into the escape plan in order to free their fellow comrades. The escapees became known as the Red Moles.
And when the wheel of life runs down and peace comes over me, just lay me down in that old town between the hills and sea. I'll take my place in those green fields, the place my life began, with the boys of Barnesroy